Welcome, everyone. On behalf of the Board of Directors of the Michigan Center for Early Christian Studies, I welcome you to tonight's public lecture with Professor Darrell Bock of Dallas Theological Seminary. But before I formally introduce him, I'd like to first thank New Life Church and Fellowship, and particularly Stevie King and Gia Stanley. They've been very helpful, and thank New Life Church for giving us this beautiful venue from which to do the event. Now, if you'll indulge me, I'd like to tell you a little bit about the Michigan Center for Early Christian Studies. The Michigan Center for Early Christian Studies, or as we call it, MCECS, is a nonprofit research association in Ann Arbor, Michigan, for the academic study of Christianity. Our organization developed from four principles. First, the academic study of Christianity is a study of the fabric of culture. The study of Christianity bears witness to its important role in the cultural developments of the last 2,000 years worldwide. Culture, particularly Western culture, cannot be adequately understood without the formal study of Christianity. The second principle of the MCECS is that Christianity did not develop in isolation from other religious traditions. The traditions and practices of Christianity reflect the early relationships and parting of the ways with Judaism and other traditions, including Greek and Roman religious traditions. Likewise, Islam, that embodies and reflects some traditions of Judaism and Christianity, where the prophets of the Old and New Testaments are very similar to the prophets in the Quran. The third and very important principle for our postmodern world is that the MCECS develops programming and supports the academic study of Christianity as a way to appreciate and increase biblical literacy. The fourth principle of the MCECS is that Christianity is not limited to the study of sacred texts or church history. As a foundational cultural agent, Christianity is reflected in various forms of media, art, architecture, and even textiles. We're dedicated to exploring how these varied manifestations of Christianity preserve and shape Christian beliefs and practices. Tonight's presentation is yet another example of such an exploration. The MCECS is a registered 501c3 nonprofit corporation. We support the above principles by offering programs such as international conferences, publications, and lecture series, of which tonight's event is one of such series, and through financial support to faculty and undergraduate and graduate students at the University of Michigan. Additional information about our activities is available on our website, mcecs.org. Please consider partnering with us to support the academic study of Christianity. We greatly appreciate any donation you can make to support our mission and purpose, which you can do at our website. And again, that's mcecs.org. Now, tonight's lecture is given by Professor Darrell Bock, someone New Life is familiar with, as he gave a lecture here back in, I believe, 2007. Professor Bock became the Executive Director of Cultural Engagement at the Hendricks Center at Dallas Theological Seminary in 2012. He is also a host of the Table podcast, Dallas Theological Seminary's weekly cultural engagement show. He is also Senior Research Professor of New Testament Studies at Dallas Theological Seminary. He was also president of the Evangelical Theological Society from 2000 to 2001 and has served as a consulting editor for Christianity Today and serves on the boards of Wheaton College in Illinois, Chosen People Ministries, the Hope Center, Christians in Public Service, and the Institute for Global Engagement. For several years, Dr. Bock has also been guest lecturer at the Bible Institute of South Africa's Winter School in Cape Town, as well as at numerous other institutions globally. Dr. Bock received his PhD from Scotland's University of Aberdeen, and he is the author or editor of over 45 books, including the well-regarded commentaries on Luke and Acts and studies on the historical Jesus. This evening's talk by Professor Bock is entitled 6 Biblical Texts on Cultural Engagement. And with that, I give you over to Professor Bock.
Thank you, John, very much. It's a pleasure to be with you this evening and to be visiting the campus here in Ann Arbor. And I'm just going to dive right in by beginning and noting that as far as I can tell, the church has not had a developed theology of cultural engagement. And we live in a very challenging time, in case you haven't noticed. And the issue of how the church copes with the pluralism that surrounds it is an important part of thinking through what the church is supposed to be today. So that's what I'm going to be talking about. I'm going to be looking at 6 texts that open this up, but I want to set some context for it. And the context I want to set for it goes back to the 1960s, the summer of 1962. So we're talking about things that have happened within my own lifetime. The slide that you see in front of you has 3 pictures on it. The one on what would be your left is a picture of Paris, France, with the Eiffel Tower symbolizing that location because of the object that's in the middle of that slide, which is when I ask people, what is that thing that's in the middle? Most people will say, well, that's the Sputnik satellite, but it's not. It's the Telstar satellite. The Telstar satellite was the first intercontinental satellite launched into space, and it did so in the summer of 1962. Before that, in order to see what was going on in the world, people had to capture it on film and take it to studios where it was developed and could be broadcast. This allowed for a direct signal going from one continent to the other, North America to Europe, when it was launched. And it was commemorated with a show that did the same thing, that basically showed the capabilities of the satellite. There are displays on YouTube, et cetera, that if you're willing to pay for it, will actually let you see the rebroadcast of the show where this happened. But it was an interesting show because the signal could only go one direction at a time. And so they broadcast in one direction, and then they did a thing called a reboot, which you may know about from your own work on a computer. And 3.5 hours later, they did the second broadcast because that's how long it took for the reboot to happen. So we're talking about very slow communication, but obviously very transformative communication, because what it did was create a world that is bigger and smaller at the same time. By which I mean, there were more of us aware of what was going on the one hand, and yet we're more tightly connected than we've ever been as a result of what grew out of the communication revolution that Telstar satellite represented. So whenever I talk about this, I always show this next, just to contrast where we were in 1962 to where we are today. I have a son who lives in Lausanne, Switzerland. I can reach him immediately, two-way, in color. You'll notice that this is black and white on this screen because the picture of the thing that's on the right that you're seeing is a thing called a television set, okay, which you may or may not recognize. And it says live from Paris via Telstar. That's a insert of the broadcast. The figure in that picture is David Brinkley of the Huntley and Brinkley NBC News, National News, who moderated the show from the North American side. And those little knobs that you see on the side are how you change the channel before there was remote control. And you'll notice that that picture is in black and white because there weren't very many colored sets in 1962. So it's just a way of showing how far we've come and how the communication revolution has really made us far more aware of one another, what the possibilities are in the world, what pluralism is. Now, I've given this lecture several times, and there was a time when I was giving it when I would talk about pluralism, and then all of a sudden I read a poll that said that 70% of the American population doesn't even know what the term pluralism means, which means I was talking about something they didn't even understand. But pluralism is basically the idea that there are plural ways, there are many ways to put life together, to think about life together, et cetera. So what I'm saying to you is that in my lifetime, the world has changed from being kind of isolated societies to be much more tightly connected than it ever was before. This started long before with the radio and television, but this really took it to a whole nother level. There are more of us and we're more tightly connected than we've ever been. The alternatives are simply a click or a swipe away. And there are more options. I compare our world today to a Middle Eastern bazaar. And whenever I think about a Middle Eastern bazaar, I think about the bazaar that I ran into in Istanbul, where one of the barkers from one of the shops said, the fastest way to your mother-in-law's heart is in my shop, which, as I was listening to this, said that assumed I cared enough about my mother-in-law to actually go into the shop. Nonetheless, we have a booth, if you will, or a mall area, which has a lot of alternatives for how to live. There are lots of booths in this bazaar, and then some of the booths in the bazaar are actually pretty bizarre themselves. And so that change, that environment is part of what we're talking about as we think about cultural engagement. So as I think about this, and my slide is not moving, so that's interesting. There we go. As I think about this, these are two pictures taken at the FIFA World Cup Museum, which is located in Zurich, Switzerland. I took these pictures years ago to illustrate the impact of the Telstar satellite. And you ask, what is a picture of a satellite, which is on the left, doing in a museum about football? And of course, we mean soccer here, for those of you who are Americans and don't know that football means something else to most of the rest of the world. Anyway, you will see that you have the picture of the satellite on the one end, and the other picture has the satellite sitting next to the soccer ball. Well, the soccer ball for the World Cup was designed to mimic the design of the Telstar satellite, because what football was commemorating was the fact that it took the Telstar satellite to make the World Cup the World Cup. That what became a world-watched tournament, sports tournament, was possible because of the communication revolution. So this is an example of the global impact of what it is that I'm talking about as we walk into this bazaar and think about the way in which we function in the world with all these choices that exist. So another thing that's happened in my lifetime, at least in the West, this isn't true globally, but it's certainly true in the West, is we have suffered the loss of what I call the Judeo-Christian net that wrapped around culture. The culture that I was born into and that I lived in when I was growing up was very much influenced in all ways and phases with the Judeo-Christian influence and the impact of Christianity and Judaism and that combination on the world. That net has gone away. In fact, the way I like to illustrate this is, in one sense, culturally, we've gone from being the home team to not just being the home team, but being the visitors. And the visitors who sometimes are viewed as the rivals who get booed. All that has happened in the space of my lifetime. And so the position of people associated with the church has also shifted dramatically in the last 60 years since the Telstar satellite was launched. I'm not saying there's a cause and effect here, but I am saying the position of the church in relationship to alternatives and the way in which those alternatives have functioned in the world was changed dramatically as soon as the world opened up. So this means that we must engage with the reality of pluralism, and coping with pluralism means being more aware of it and the need to be more engaged with the options that it represents. And we're all coping with this in one way or another, whether we're in the church or not. So what I want to do is take a look at 6 texts that actually define how do you engage in with a culture as varied as our culture has become. In fact, I tell people the moment you ask the question, what is our culture like? You've actually fogged up the conversation, because you've oversimplified a world that isn't made up of culture in the singular, it's made up of cultures in the plural. And so we have many, many cultures in this bazaar that we're talking about. And they're like plate tectonics. If you think through your geology, and if I'm taking you back to a traumatic time in junior high, I apologize. But as you're thinking about this experience that you had in geology class with plate tectonics, they rub against each other. And if you build up enough pressure, you get an earthquake. So the picture here is of how do we deal with the variety of cultures that we interact with as we hit the world that we're in. So here's what I'm saying. The Telstar satellite and the challenge of being bigger and smaller at the same time is a reality that has hit our world over the last several years. In fact, I read today, I was reading in a book on culture, and it said that something like the average person in their lifetime processes about the equivalent of 74 gigabytes of information in a given day because of the information revolution. That used to be how much information a person processed in their lifetime before the communication revolution and before the print revolution. So we've gone from having access to a very narrow amount of information over the period of a lifetime to having to process an immense amount of information on any given day, much less one's lifetime. So this produces the challenge of pluralism, which the church is no longer the home team. So how do they cope in the midst of that environment? And then I have a thesis, and the thesis is that the culture war with which many in the church have engaged culture with through the church in the last several decades is actually misdirected about the mission of the church and has done the church and our society damage in the process. So I'm challenging the idea that there is a culture war that we're supposed to be engaged in when we think about where the church is supposed to fit in the world. And so I hope through this lecture to show biblically why that is and what the corrective needs to be in order to get, if you will, back on track. So to do that, I want to work through 6 texts that show the tone and approach that at least believers are supposed to have according to the instruction of the scriptures. And I hope that sets a different tone and a different way for the church to be in the midst of this variety that I'm talking about that is a part of the cultures that we are surrounded with today. So with that, I'll start with the 6 texts of theology of culture engagement. The fact that I have 6 texts means you can count and follow along with me as I go. You can know how far I am from the start and how far I am from the finish. But let me start with what is the cultural war text in the New Testament. It's Ephesians 6:10-18, which is, as I said, the cultural war text of the New Testament. It's a long passage. I'm going to go through it all in a second, but the key verse that I'm interested in that sets the tone for the thesis that I have is Ephesians 6:12, which is on the screen. It says, "For our struggle is not, not, that's emphatic, against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the powers, against the world rulers of this darkness." This text is arguing that there is a spiritual battle going on, that there is warfare, if you will, going on, but that struggle is not against other human beings. The other human beings are not the enemy. They are actually the goal for the church, which is how the mission gets offline when we make people the enemy. Our struggle is not against flesh and blood. The word for struggle here is actually the picture of a wrestling match, hand-to-hand combat. That hand-to-hand combat is not primarily aimed at flesh and blood people, but rather against spiritual forces at work in the world. The Greek word for the spiritual forces here is the word cosmocrat. And you can tell sometimes I have a sense of humor, and my humor at this point says, if you think a bureaucrat is bad, you should meet a cosmocrat. So we're sitting here thinking about the way in which these spiritual forces work and how to think about the position and the posture of the church in relationship to the world. And what that raises then is the way in which the entire text manifests itself. So I'm going to take a look, and if you are following along with me and you want to follow along with a Bible, you can open up to Ephesians chapter 6, because I'm going to work through it a little bit at a time here, as I'll be doing with all the passages I discussed tonight. It starts in Ephesians 6:10. So if you're in your Bibles and if you're swiping because you have an electronic device, or you have a thing called Pages because you have a book, Bible, however you get there, we're in Ephesians 6:10. It says this: "Finally, be strengthened in the Lord and the strength of his power. Clothe yourselves with the full armor of God, so that you may be able to stand against the schemes of the devil. For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the powers, against the world rulers of this darkness, against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly places." There's a spiritual battle. It's an unseen spiritual battle. is basically what the text is saying. For this reason, take up the full armor of God so that you may be able to stand your ground on the evil day, and having done everything to stand. And the observation I want to make about verse 13 is this. We are not told in this text to take new ground. We are told in this text to stand the ground that we've been given as a result of knowing the Lord and knowing what it is that he asks of us as human beings. It says, stand firm, therefore, by fastening the belt of truth around your waist, by putting on the breastplate of righteousness, by fitting your feet with the preparation that comes from the good news of peace, and in all this, taking up the shield of faith, with which you can extinguish all the flaming arrows of the evil one. Take the helmet of salvation, the sword of the Spirit, which is the word of God, and with every prayer and petition, pray at all times in the Spirit. To this end, be alert with all perseverance and petitions for all the saints. And then he goes on to ask for prayer for himself because he's writing from prison. Here's the point. The armor that is supposed to protect us in the midst of the world today is our lived out faith. It's our lived out faith. It includes things like righteousness, a righteous life. It includes things like the gospel of peace. It includes things like the truth. It includes things like faith and salvation and the word of God and prayer. And so the argument here is that the way in which we show what God is about in the world as people who follow God in the world is by the way we live out our faith consistently. I noticed when I walked into New Life Church that the mission statement includes the Great Commission and the Great Commandment side by side. That's a good central feature of the way one as a Christian is called to live, coming out of a biblical exhortation in a text like this. Now, what does that mean for the way in which the church has been functioning in the world? And I have in mind here certain parts of the church that have been particularly loud recently. What it means is that the battle metaphor changes. And so I want to put an idea in your head. I want you to think about yourself being connected to the GIA. That's not the CIA, but the GIA, God's intelligence agency. And rather than thinking about the culture war, meaning that we're like two battalions lined up against one another in which one group of people is supposed to overrun and overwhelm another group of people, that actually what you're kind of engaged in is a kind of a mission, a rescue mission, if I can say it that way, where you're trying to help people around you make sense out of their lives, not just your life, but their lives. And in the midst of doing that, you're going in and trying to help someone who needs to be helped in terms of being oriented towards God. And the calling then is not of one battalion overrunning another, but almost like how can I say, special forces coming in and rescuing someone in trouble. But this is tricky because of the way it works today. Because as I've said, people are not the enemy, they're actually the goal. The point of this exercise is to encourage people to think about their walk with God, who God has made them as human beings, what their relationship to God should be like, those kinds of things. And then here's the third piece, and this is the hard piece. The battle is a spiritual one, which requires spiritual resources. That's why the armor is our lived out Christian faith. It's not political ideology. It's not even politics in general. It's the way we engage with one another as people made in the image of God. And it's that the enemy at work who distracts or knocks people off course works incognito. In fact, he's so incognito that many people won't even recognize that he exists. 30% of our population in the United States is described as religiously none. That's not N-U-N-S, that's N-O-N-E-S. They have no religious orientation at all. God doesn't even exist in their way of thinking. And so we have spiritual forces at work who work incognito, who help or distract people from thinking about who they are made to be and what they're supposed to be about in the world. And they work, and because they work incognito, that means that people are living their lives searching for who they are. You sometimes hear this phrase. They say, I'm trying to find myself. Again, the humor part of me says, well, I thought you were here all along. No, I'm trying to find myself. I'm trying to figure out why I'm here and what life is supposed to be about. And that's the work of unseen forces. So it's one thing to rescue someone who's been kidnapped, or has been captured by something that isn't healthy and they recognize it. It's another thing when the person doesn't even know they have a problem, or if all they know is I can't get located in terms of where I am. And so this first text is an exhortation to have us think about the fact that it's our lived out Christian faith that stands in contrast to the way much of the world may function, that is the most powerful armor and the most powerful display of God being at work in our lives. So that's the first text. That's Ephesians 6:10-18. The second text is from 1 Peter chapter 3. Now, this is a well-known text to people who ever engage in a Bible memory program. You know, sometimes in discipleship and that kind of thing, we engage in a Bible memory program where you learn very key verses of the Bible. And almost every one of these Bible memory programs has 1 Peter 3:15 in it, which reads, "But set Christ apart as Lord in your hearts and always be ready to give an answer to anyone who asks about the hope you possess." In fact, this is the verse that we get the Christian term apologetics from, because in this verse where it says to give a defense, that's the Greek word apologia, which is the Greek word for we get the term apologetics from. We're not apologizing for anything. We're simply giving a defense. The Greek term means to give a defense. But I want to observe not so much the idea about the call to set Christ apart and always be ready to give a defense or always be ready to give an answer, but I want to zero in on another part of the verse, because it says that we're supposed to respond to anyone who asks about the hope we possess, which means that Peter had the option to summarize the Christian faith with one word. And the word that he chose to summarize the Christian faith with was the word hope. Now, if I were to go out on the street or if I were to go in a church and ask people, summarize the faith in one word, I imagine I'd get all kinds of answers: Christ, forgiveness, grace, love. I could think of all kinds of things. I'm not sure hope would make the top 5. But here, what Peter is stressing is that we're supposed to be in a position to share the hope that we have in Christ, and that our faith offers hope to the world. And that's important, because when I look at how the church interacts with those outside the church today, the first word that leaps to mind about what the message of the church isn't the word hope. I could think of all kinds of other terms that leap to mind as we engage with people who we might want to have consider what it means to walk with God at their side. Now, I also want to put this verse into context. So I want to back up and I want to go through the whole paragraph, because there are other things in here that also are important about engagement. So I'm going to back up to chapter 3 and verse 13. And it starts off this way: "For who's going to harm you if you are devoted to what is good?" Straightforward verse. This is what I taught my kids when they were growing up. This is what I hope my kids teach my grandkids growing up. And that is, do the right thing. Do the right thing and everything should go smoothly. You won't get into trouble. This is the way to live. Who's going to harm you if you're devoted to what is good? And the verse starts off with a perfectly normal, what we would consider perhaps a perfectly normal expectation, only there's one problem. We live in a fallen world. So the next verse follows: "But in fact, if you happen to suffer for doing what is right, you are blessed." Now that's interesting, because of the phrase, and we're going to see it in variation 3 times in this passage. If you happen to suffer for doing what's right, this invokes what I like to call Bock's law, and that is, every good deed will get punished. Okay, that's life in the fallen world, that every good deed gets punished. So the anticipation is, yes, no one's going to harm you if you're devoted to what's good, but in a fallen world, it might happen that you do the right thing and you suffer for doing the right thing. But if you do, you're blessed. And then there's one reaction you're not supposed to have when this happens. It is, do not be terrified of them or be shaken. That's the second part of verse 14. The one response we're not supposed to have to people who push back against doing the right thing in the world is to be terrified of them or to be shaken. And yet sometimes when I look at the church, what I see is a response that comes out of being terrified or being fearful or being shaken by what's going on around us. That's not a good way to respond, because when you do that, you're likely to make mistakes. So we get our verse following this, but set Christ apart as Lord in your hearts and always be ready to give an answer to anyone who asks about the hope you possess. But then I tell my students when they're doing Bible study, sometimes it's important to keep reading. The next verse is also quite important because it says, yet do it with courtesy and respect, keeping a good conscience, so that those who slander your good conduct in Christ may be put to shame when they accuse you. That's an interesting verse for a couple of reasons. Notice how it begins. You give this defense, you talk about this hope, but you do it with courtesy and respect. There are two key Greek words in the beginning of verse 16, the word pratetos and phobou. Pratetos is meekness or gentleness. What my translation is translated as courtesy. And phobou is the idea of fear or respect. The beginning of wisdom is fear of the Lord. In the Greek translation of the Hebrew, the word phobos is where the word fear appears. In the beginning of wisdom is fear of the Lord. So there's a tone, there's an attitude that comes with the hope that we have. I like to tell people that when you think about the gospel that the church shares, it has two elements in it. It has a challenge element that deals with sin. And we emphasize the sin oftentimes when we talk in public. We walk into a church that has the cross as a symbol for the presence of sin. In fact, even in this sanctuary, there's a cross sitting right over there that I'm looking at as a symbol. And we issue and talk about the challenge. And sometimes our engagement with the culture is an engagement about the challenge of sin being in our world and the world being a fallen place. But if I never get to the hope, which is the second part, there's challenge and there's hope. If I never get to the invitation about reconnecting to the living God and the way in which God makes that possible, I never actually get to the gospel. The gospel isn't on the challenge side of the message. The gospel is on the hope side and the invitation side of the message that's being offered to people. And so we do this with a tone that's not designed to shove away. It's actually designed to invite someone in to an experience of the goodness and grace of God that he has provided through what it is that Jesus Christ is said to have done for humanity. So this is an important text. And the tone is important, yet do it with courtesy and respect, keeping a good conscience. So those who slander your good conduct in Christ, notice that second phrase, you're doing the right thing in Christ, but you're getting slandered for it. That's the second time Bock's law has been invoked. Every good deed will get punished. Maybe put to shame when they accuse you. And then the third time, for it is better to suffer for doing good, if God wills it, than for doing evil. We're not supposed to respond in kind. We're not supposed to respond evil for evil, or eye for eye, or tooth for tooth. We're supposed to love our enemies. We're supposed to be different. Our lived out faith has a distinct quality to it of engagement that's supposed to stand out in contrast to the way in which the world usually tribally fights within the basic groupings within itself. Now, this raises the question, why do I do this? Why should I live in this way? And the text goes on, I'm going to keep reading. The text goes on to say it this way in verse 18. Because Christ also suffered once for sins, there's the challenge part, but God stepping in to that challenge and saying, I'm going to offer you a way out that you don't have to supply for yourself. I'm going to offer you a way out that I'm going to supply on your behalf. The just for the unjust, Jesus dying for those who were sinners. And then there comes what I call a curveball, or if you're British, I'll invoke cricket. It's an in-swinger, okay? And that is, it isn't to say to bring them to God, but to bring you to God. So what is Peter doing here? What Peter is doing here is reminding people that when they were walking outside the way and the will of God, God took the initiative with them when their backs were turned. And so you're never supposed to forget where you came from within the context of your relationship with God when you're sharing with someone who may not have a relationship with God today. You have the opportunity to put yourself in the position that God took with reference to you when you meet someone whose back is turned to God and you're engaging with them about what it is that the Christian faith is about. So what I'm saying in this second passage is that our engagement is supposed to have an emphasis on hope, that hope is the message that is supposed to be the primary driver for how we engage, and it's supposed to be done with a proper tone. And that proper tone has to do with gentleness and respect. Now, if we have any doubt about that, the remaining 4 passages are going to reinforce what I've said in these first 2 texts. So let me take you to the next text. I'm going to move through the next text a little more quickly. The next text is Colossians 4, 5, and 6. And this is an interesting passage for a variety of reasons. It says, conduct yourselves with wisdom towards outsiders, making the most of the opportunities. I find it interesting that the scripture says that this engagement with outsiders, people who don't know God, actually represent opportunities for people in the church. And that engagement with those on the outside, the engagement with those who don't know God, engagement even with those who may be hostile towards God, represents an opportunity. And then there's this advice: let your speech always, 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 that's emphatic, be gracious. Season with salt, so that you may know how you should answer everyone. There's a technical term in this verse, and the technical term in this verse is the term always. Now, when I have a big crowd in front of me, I will ask them, so give me a definition of always. And what some people will say is, well, the definition of always is always. And I go, you don't define a term by using the term you're defining. So think about another way to say always. And they will say every time, constantly, whatever. Here's always: 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year, 366 days in a leap year. You don't get to take a day off every 4 years. Okay. Always means always. And your speech is supposed to always be gracious. Again, I ask the question of the church engaging in our world today, segments of the church that I'm aware of, and I ask, how much would that interaction be characterized as gracious on the basis of what we're seeing? And the answer is probably not enough. So that's Colossians 4, 5, and 6. That says that our speech is always to be gracious. The 4th text that I want to discuss is Galatians 6:10. Now, I need to give context for this. Galatians 6:10 comes in a section of the book of Galatians, the letter to the Galatians, in which Paul is discussing the royal law of love, loving your neighbor as yourself as an extension of your love for God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength, what's known as the Great Commandment. And this is a classic sermon in that he goes through the theological grounding in chapters 5 and 6. And then in 6:10, he goes, therefore, or so then. And the way I say it's a classic sermon, it's like the pastor gets up and gives you all the doctrine in 40 minutes. And then in the last 5 minutes of his sermon, assuming a 45-minute sermon, maybe I should go to 25 minutes. Okay. He gives you the application right at the end. This is the application of these 2 chapters. And here's what it says. So whenever we have an opportunity, notice the word opportunity again, let us do good to all people. That's emphatic. And especially to those who belong to the family of faith. So this is an exhortation, not just about our speech, but about how we engage with anyone and everyone who crosses our path. We're supposed to do good to all people. And again, all is a technical term. It means everybody and anybody. In the background of this text, I think about a passage that Jesus taught. Now, this is not one of my 6 texts, but I'm going to throw it in here anyway. And that is what I call the parable of the Indianapolis 500. The parable of the Indianapolis 500 is about a set of questions that came from a lawyer. Sorry, John. Okay. A lawyer came up, a scribe came up and asked Jesus, what must I do to inherit eternal life? And the answer came about keeping the commandments, the second half of the 10 commandments in particular. And the lawyer and the great commandment gets cited as well. The idea of you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. And the lawyer, because lawyers sometimes don't know when to stop asking questions, asked a follow-up. And the follow-up question was, so who is my neighbor? Now, What you need to understand is in asking, who is my neighbor, he actually was asking a different question. He was asking the question, who is not my neighbor? He was fishing for the scope of what his responsibilities were interacting with someone else. And this led to what I call the parable of the Indianapolis 500. Well, what parable is that? That's the parable of the Good Samaritan. You know the story. Man fell among robbers and was left for dead. A priest came around the corner, and you're thinking as the priest comes around the corner, oh, surely the priest will help this man who's hurting. And what you get is this. He zooms by that guy as fast as he can. Second comes a Levite, and the Levite comes around the corner, and you think, oh, surely the Levite will help this man. And what does the Levite do? Goes right by the guy as fast as he can. Then comes a Samaritan. Now, the reason I'm saying it that way is because when we get to the end of the parable and the lawyer is asked who proved to be a neighbor among the man who fell among the thieves, the lawyer can't even answer Samaritan. He says the one who showed mercy. And of course, what happens is the Samaritan comes around the corner, and this is what happens. He doesn't zoom around the guy. He does this, puts on the brakes. And in 8 consecutive passages of 8 concrete acts, works to care for the man who fell among the thieves. And then Jesus asks this question. He says, who proved to be a neighbor to the man who fell among the thieves? And of course, then the lawyer answers, well, the one who showed mercy. By the way, that term mercy is important because it raises the theme of empathy and having empathy for people in our world who are struggling to locate themselves in this world. There's a lot of debate in certain segments of the church about whether empathy is a healthy virtue, which surprises me because they sometimes will define it by saying, well, what we mean is untethered empathy, empathy just for the sake of being empathetic and not caring about the moral things that stand behind it. That I get. The trouble is when they talk about it, they don't talk about untethered empathy. They talk about empathy in general. In fact, there was a book written very recently called The Sin of Empathy. And when I hear that, I go, how in the world can that be a good response to what's going on around us as we culturally engage, to deny empathy? Because at the center of God's response to us when he brought us to himself was his empathetic and compassionate and merciful interaction with who we are and what our needs were in relationship to our own sin. Now, there's another observation to make about this text that I have to make, and it is, so then whenever we have an opportunity, let us do good to all people, especially to those who belong to the family of faith. And what's interesting about this is that the exhortation is we're supposed to treat everybody the same way without distinction. Why does that matter? That matters because sometimes you have some people who say, I'm supposed to treat believers one way, but then if it's anybody else, it's open game. And I'm sitting here going, this passage prevents you from doing that. This passage is important for another reason. And here I'm thinking about Matthew 25, where Jesus talks about, did you care for me? Did you feed me, etc.? Huge debate among New Testament scholars in general and people in general about whether that text is about how we treat everybody or whether we only treat people who are also believers. I think a good case can actually be made that this is about how we treat people who are walking with Christ, but this text prevents you from making the other application out of this, which means I can treat everybody else however I want. This text is saying, do good to all people. It should certainly be happening among people of faith. So I'm supposed to treat everybody the same way. If I have any doubt about this, it's what Jesus said about love. What makes Christian love distinct is not that I love those who love me. What makes Christian love distinct is I even love my enemies. Jesus, in fact, made a point. If you only love those who love you, what's the big deal in that? Even sinners do that. And we're supposed to do more than that. So this text is reinforcing something that Jesus taught in making the point that we're supposed to make an effort to do good to all people. And now I'm back to the parable of the Indianapolis 500, where the point is not to ask the question, who is my neighbor or who is not my neighbor? The exhortation of the parable is be a good neighbor. Be a good neighbor to anybody and everybody. And then a little side remark because of the Samaritan is, and sometimes neighbors come in surprising packages. That brings us to the next text. This is in 2 Corinthians chapter 5. And it says, so then, if anyone is in Christ, he's a new creature. Behold, old things have passed away, and the new has come. These things are from God, who has reconciled us to himself through Christ, and who has given us the ministry of reconciliation. Here's another text that summarizes Christian faith in one word. And here it has to do with the effect of the Christian faith as opposed to the hope that Peter mentioned. And that one word is the word reconciliation. God is in the business of taking people, estranged people, people who do not get along with one another, people who are treating one another through the lens of sin, and bringing them together and to reconciling them to one another. I like to say that Christianity is a non-tribal religion in a tribal world. If you look at the second half of Ephesians 2, the idea is that God has brought Jews and Gentiles together into one new man, into one new community. Jews and Gentiles didn't get along in the first century. They fought with one another. They had a contentious history with one another. And yet, corporately, the goal of salvation, this is not a sideshow, it's not politics. The whole point of the exercise is to bring estranged people groups together so they can function alongside each other, so that by the time we get to Revelation 4 and 5 or Revelation 7, we have people of many tribes and many nations sharing in their engagement with God together side by side, despite their different backgrounds. So this text says we've been given this ministry of reconciliation. And then verse 19 says, in other words, in Christ, God was reconciling the world to himself, not counting people's transgressions against them, as he has given us the message of reconciliation. Therefore, we are ambassadors for Christ. We are members of a heavenly community. If Philippians says we are citizens of heaven, that's our most important passport. And we're ambassadors. We represent God by how we live on the earth. And as though God were making a plea through us, notice the tone of this as the invitation goes out for the gospel to be reconciled to God. As the God were making a plea through us, we plead with you on Christ's behalf, be reconciled to God. And so this is the tone piece coming at us again, yet again, with this invitation, this opportunity to respond to God, this call to be reconnected to the living God that God has made possible through what he's done on our behalf. And then it goes on to explain, God made the one who did not sin to be sin for us so that in him we might become the righteousness of God. That's how the flip can happen. So we're ambassadors of reconciliation. Our speech is always supposed to be seasoned with salt and be gracious. We're supposed to be prepared to give a defense for the hope that is in us. We're not supposed to fear when people push against us. And we're supposed to wear the armor of God. Our lived out Christian life is the way to put on the armor of God. It's not our politics. Last text. This text summarizes everything that I've said, and with this text, I'll be done. It says, this is 2 Timothy 2, 22 to 24. This text almost never comes up in these conversations, but it's a nice summary of what I've been saying. Here is Paul's advice to Timothy, a young pastor, about what to teach people when they're engaging with what's going on around them and how he's supposed to engage himself, because his lived out faith is supposed to be the point. But keep away from youthful passions and pursue righteousness, faithfulness, love, and peace in company with others who call on the Lord from a pure heart. That verse 22 is the armor of God put in concrete exhortation language. It takes the figure of the armor away and leaves us with the lived out faith that we started with. Okay. But avoid foolish and ignorant controversies, because you know they breed infighting. And the Lord's slave must not engage in heated disputes, but be kind towards, all. Be kind towards all. An apt teacher, patient, correcting opponents with, gentleness. Tone is in this text as well. Perhaps God will grant them repentance and then knowledge of the truth, and they will come to their senses and escape the devil's trap where they are held captive to his will, and we're back where we started. We're in a spiritual battle that involves spiritual forces that are unseen, often unrecognized, present and influencing the way people think in the world in such a ways that the Bible calls people either blind or living in darkness because of the way in which we live destructively with one another. And in the midst of that, the way out is to change the way we live by pushing us towards the love of God, the transformation that he brings to the heart, the opportunity he has to deal with sin on the one hand and enable us to live differently on the other, as we're called to engage in the world through our lived out faith, which lives in a context of hope, which does so with gentleness and respect, which does so by speaking graciously to all, which does so by doing good to all, especially to those of the faith, which then makes us representative ambassadors who reflect the character of God about how he's lived with us, so that finally we live in such a way that we pursue our lived out faith. It becomes a light that shines in the midst of darkness, and it may just show another way to live than the way the world lives. That is a theology of cultural engagement coming from 6 texts of the Bible, and I hope you found that enlightening.
Thank you, Dr. Bock. Thus far, I don't have any questions in the chat room. Any questions from the audience?
Early on, you mentioned like how it's harder to engage in this conversation when people don't realize that they're, I guess, like, I don't know, but they're
Impacted by forces around them.
yes.
Yeah.
So what's like a good way to engage in that conversation without making them feel like you're just trying to attack them?
Well, I think what you do is you actually ask questions. I do a series of talks on the topic of cultural engagement. The next talk is how to have difficult conversations. And what I say is, when you're engaging with someone who's coming from a completely different place than you are, you need to understand how those conversations work. And all conversations have basically 3 elements tied to them. There's the topic that you're talking about. There's the lenses that you see that topic through. And lenses cause you to focus on certain things, but because you're focused on certain things, it also means you may miss certain things. The lenses through which you look at it, when I discuss lenses, all I have to say is CNN and Fox. Okay, they're looking at the same reality out there. It's the same reality for everybody. But because of the lenses they each wear, when you listen to them describing what's around them and what the reality is, you wonder if they live on the same planet. Okay, that's how lenses work. They cause us to focus on certain things and pay attention to certain things, prioritize certain things, and they cause us at the same time perhaps to miss certain things that we need to pay attention to in our conversations. This is why a conversation can be healthy if someone's coming from a different perspective, because there may be something that they are seeing that I'm not seeing because of the nature of the lenses that I have. So that's the second one, the lenses that you use to see. And then the third one is how your identity is tied to what it is that you're talking about. So that third layer is important because that gets at why people are oriented to the topics the way that they are and what they feel like is at stake, either in terms of their identity or interests that cause them to view that topic in a certain way. So the point that I would make is that what I would do in a difficult conversation is, rather than tell, is to ask. I ask questions. How do you see the world the way that you do? What drives you? What do you think is important in the world, et cetera? You let them talk. You let them tell their story. Hopefully, by hearing them tell their story and what drives them, you actually have some clues as to how to pursue a conversation with them. And in some cases, you'll get an admission. You'll get an admission that they're still trying to figure out what life's all about, or they're not sure why they're here, or they're not sure where they fit in the world, et cetera. Well, at that point, the Christian faith is very, very clear about making sense about who we are and who we're designed to be. We're made in the image of God. We're made not just a call to treat one another well and to collaborate well in the creation so the creation hums, but that we're also supposed to love God and love our neighbor. That's part of the purpose of how we live. God made us as collaborative beings in his image. That's part of the story of Genesis 1. He put the woman next to the man and said, she's going to be a helpmeet who comes alongside you and helps you to manage the creation well. I tell people we were designed to collaborate together to make the creation hum. And yet we've turned our relationships into competition in which we compete with one another. So it's ideas like that. So what I do is I talk about what the nature of life is ideally designed and what will make life flourish. And then hopefully there's enough of a disconnect that may raise the question about what to do about what's in front of them.
Are there ways that, I can just jump in with a question, are there ways that you would suggest having conversations with people who are others in the church who are in that, like, we need to gain ground, we need to more of that combative.
Yeah, it depends on what they're fighting, what they want to fight over and how they want to do it. Here's what I think this text is saying to us. It says that sometimes the church can be defending the right thing, but if I defend the right thing in the wrong way, I'm wrong. That the engagement that I have with people is an engagement that not only takes place at an intellectual level about what I know, but it takes place at a relational level at the same time. And I can't disengage those. They're like a double helix of a DNA. Both of them matter. In fact, I tell people that what's going on in the world today, particularly with a religious nun, okay, who doesn't have a theological bone in their body, which means that when I want to talk to them about who Christ is, I'm in the business of creating categories they don't have. Okay, I tell people evangelism today in our world is creating categories for people that don't have those categories. And if you think about what the core of the Christian message is in the world and for people, there are four key questions that have to be aligned for the story to make sense. The first is that there is a God, a singular God. Okay, you have to start there. The second is, and this has to do with how we handle the Bible, and I ask it this way. When you say God says, or the Bible says to a religious nun, what have they heard? Okay, and the answer is a little ditty that I'd like to put together. Nothing. That's what that means to me. Nothing. Absolutely nothing. 2, 3, 4. If they don't believe that God exists and or they don't believe that God speaks and has revealed himself, then your citing the Bible doesn't do them any good. They don't see it as an authority. And then I say, and then what the church has done is we've taught people to say this to people because we say it's true because it's in the Bible. Okay, which doesn't work with a religious nun. But what we've got to understand is what the Bible is. The term revelation actually means a disclosure. It's a disclosure of something. So something's not true because it's in the Bible. It's in the Bible because it's true on its own merit. So we need to teach people how to, what I call switch hit. They need to be able to go either way. And when I'm having a conversation with someone about the nature of life, and I'm talking about principles that come out of the Bible for what makes sense out of life, what orders life, what can make life flourish, etc., I don't need to appeal to the Bible for the things that the Bible is saying. I need to appeal on the merits of what it is that's being argued for on its own terms, because that's why it's in the Bible. That's a different way of thinking about how we engage with someone on the outside. So that's the second question. The third question is even more disturbing. Okay, when you say Jesus is the Son of God, okay, do that with a little emphasis so that you get the point. Okay, Jesus is the Son of God. Do you realize how unusual that claim is for someone who's a religious nun? Think about it this way. I once asked Google, how many people have walked the face of the earth in the history of humanity? And Google, surprisingly, gave me an answer. Okay, 117 billion. Now, I don't know how they know that number, where they came to that number, but let's just say they're close, give or take. Out of the 117 billion human beings who have walked the earth, how many could credibly claim to be the creator God incarnate? One. That qualifies to me as an unusual category. Okay. That's an unusual category. You're in the business of creating a category that the person probably doesn't have. And that category's got to be in place for the story of what the Bible's talking about to make sense. Okay. And the fourth one's also problematic for people who don't have a religious bone in their body, because the fourth one is, and you're accountable to this God whether you recognize it or not. So now the question becomes, how do I take someone who, when they encounter the Christian message, doesn't even have the categories for it? Okay, it's a good question. And my answer is, the only way it happens is relationally. They have to trust you enough as a person that when you introduce a category to them that they don't have or they've never thought about, they're willing to entertain the possibility of that category based upon the way you've engaged with them and treated them. So this relational element is key. In fact, I would say not only is the relational element key for that reason, but think about the fruit of the Spirit. The fruit of the Spirit is fundamentally relational. Love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, etc. Okay, so this relational element is important. So what I'm saying to the person who's pushing back and says that we need to fight, I'm not saying don't back off from your convictions, but how you frame those convictions, how you talk about those convictions, how you approach someone with those convictions makes all the difference in the world. And if you will honor the idea that I'm supposed to do so respectfully, I'm supposed to do so meekly or humbly, I'm supposed to do so graciously, if I put those parameters into place, okay, that's how to do it. And then I make one other point. Because sometimes some of the topics that come up for discussion are viewed to be outside the faith or outside the relevance of the faith. No term probably sits here as uncomfortably as the term justice. Okay. If you talk about justice, you're talking about politics. If you talk about justice, you're talking about political ideology. Okay. For that, I get to the question this way. Did Isaiah, Amos, Micah, and Jesus predate Karl Marx? Okay, just think about that for a second. Does the Bible talk about justice? Okay, that means that you can have those conversations and you're not necessarily in a political ideological space. You're in a biblical space. You're in a space that relates to how our faith has been discussed and presented long before there was Marxism. So there are ways to get into some of these topics that reflect, I would say, a Christian and biblical orientation that counter the way in which they get framed in the modern world. I actually think that the problem we have with terms like justice and the way in which race is being debated, et cetera, today is a function of the fact that that we're still living in the shadow of the fundamentalist modernist controversy. And what I mean by that is that in the late 19th century, when the fundamentalist modernist controversy came along and political liberalism emerged alongside theological liberalism, what happened is that people were saying, well, we like the ethics of the Bible, but we're not sure we believe all of the Bible or the theological side of that story entirely. And they separated the two. Conservatives looked at that and said, ooh, we like that deal, but it's the exact reverse for us. Okay. We like the theological story, and this stuff over here has become the playpen of liberals. Okay. And they pulled apart something that was originally designed to be put together. Okay. And then my line is, and I know I'm stealing this from another context, but what God has joined together, let no man put asunder. Okay. These things belong together. They fit together. But the trouble is, if you go to put those together now with that overhang of the way liberal and conservatives have divided the space up, it becomes a difficult conversation. So yeah. So how do I respond to someone who wants to push back and fight? You say to them, look, I'm quite content to have and share a conversation about how to have conviction and how to speak for Christian convictions in the world. But it isn't just what I believe, it's how I do it. And how I do it is also talked about in the Bible, and I need to take how to do it seriously.
Professor Bock has said, thank you, Darrell. It's very important that you took your 6 texts from the Pauline tradition One of those old guys that forgets to do this stuff. Professor Boccaccini says, thanks, Darrell. It's very important that you took your 6 texts from the Pauline tradition. We did have Peter, but most of them were from Paul.
Correct.
Very often we had misinterpreted Paul as a messenger of condemnation
Yes,
instead of as a messenger of mercy.
yes. And mercy, the key point, and the point I made about empathy is in the middle of that point. And what I often say when I give this talk is that a person who tries to share Christ with someone who needs what Christ has to offer needs to never forget where they came from. That they have the position they have because of the grace, mercy, and the kindness of God. And the initiation that he took. In fact, I tell people, if you'll listen carefully to the testimony of people who share how they came to faith who did not grow up in a Christian home, somewhere in that testimony is a piece that goes something like this. I wasn't teaching the things of God, and then I met, and then it's either a person or got connected to a group. And they lived differently, and that got my attention, and it made me curious. Okay, what is that showing? That's showing that relational principle. That's showing that relational principle of 1, a different way to live, but 2, a way of engaging and reaching out to the person who wasn't a part of the group, to connect with, etc. And on the basis of that, and thinking through what the mercy initiation of God is, we love because he first loved us. Starting with that point, that's the starting point for an engagement to pull people into what it is that God is about in the world and what he asks of those who claim to represent him in the world.
Can I raise a question about cultures?
Yes.
So the tone or what you've been saying about cultures strikes me as about cultures that one would think of in the American context. So people who are from a particular political, or people who are from a particular cause, or something like that, but they engage in the American cultural faith. Most of the cultures that I encounter in a place like this are from outside the United States.
Correct.
And cultures there are have a number of similar elements, but they're quite diverse, and they are structured around themes such as totalitarianism or communism, Hinduism, Buddhism, a whole series of cultures that are unknown except in their context. How does that affect?
Well, the point that I mean, I am talking about the,
Excuse me.
yeah, go ahead.
Somewhat, you said, and that is that how do we engage with cultures, even the ones we meet here, that are oftentimes outside the United States that come in, such as we have people who have come from a totalitarian culture. We have people that have come from, that are Buddhists, Hindus, and different religious persuasions who are here. How do we engage with that pluralism of people?
Well, let me add one other element of pluralism, because we live in a border town.
Yes.
You live in a border town.
Yes,
Your border community is very different than ours.
correct.
Canadians are very that those from Mexico.
I know, I was born in Canada.
That's right.
Yeah,
Cal,
that's right.
Calgary.
Yeah, Calgary, yeah. Yes.
Cross the oceans or from a different continent. Within the continent, you have the same.
Well, actually, if I were to add another sociological layer to my beginning, it is that people have been moving in unprecedented levels in our lifetime. Okay, the amount of dispersion of peoples across places where they weren't born, et cetera. I love telling this story. When I was in Scotland, I lived in a little village, Torfins. It was about 800 people. It's located 20 kilometers from Aberdeen. And our closest friend in that village, closest Scottish friend in that village, his father was 75 years old and only spent one night away from his home his entire life. And that was by accident. He got fogged in Edinburgh and couldn't get back to Torfinns. Otherwise, it would have been every night of his life. When he told me that story, I went, I don't know anyone who comes even close to living that way, you know? So yeah, there's a lot of different, what I'm saying about culture applies across the board. I've given this talk, not only here in the US, I've given it in Australia, I've given it in New Zealand, I've given it in India, I've given it in South Africa. Okay, because the principles that we're talking about how you treat people, how you engage with people, how you listen to people, what you're willing to learn in the exchanges and be open to and think about, is a part of all this. And so, again, I do think the Bible has a certain way of seeing the world and life and the worldliness of it and the way God has designed it that I think anyone needs to hear and that's valuable to think about and that I think is on offer for anyone. But that's not to the exclusion of the different experiences that people have in different parts of the world. And so we actually did a series on my podcast in which we did world religions. And most of the world religions that we looked at were Eastern religions that most Americans aren't familiar with at all. And we asked 3 questions. We didn't do the normal thing that often happens. And I come out of a conservative theological background where you take what the religion teaches and compare it to what's in the Bible. We did it this way. We said, first of all, what does this religion believe? And is it even a religion? Because in some cases, you're not dealing with a religion, but more a philosophy. So that was the second question is, what's the Velcro factor for this religion? Why is it that someone would adhere to this religion? What's the connection point for them? What does it offer them? That kind of thing. And we focused on that. And then the third question is, how does the gospel speak to that Velcro factor? So what we were trying to do is to ask the question, where is this person coming from in terms of how they see life and how they put life together? And how does that contrast and compare to what's going on in the Bible? What does the Bible have to offer them? That was how we did it. And so, because, you know, I believe deeply that the Christianity is a global faith and God is a global God. So he's aware of all these contexts that we're dealing with, et cetera, and what people fundamentally need in thinking about how they interact with each other, being made in the image of God, et cetera, and how to treat one another and interact with one another. So yeah, I think you're right that part of the cultural war part of this talk is very much focused on the United States and what's going on here in North America, although that actually is being exported around the world even as we speak. But the other part of it is to say, no, there's a fundamental relational orientation that I'm presenting in here that works anywhere.
And what you've been saying, it brings me back to Paul before the Areopagus,
Exactly.
and how he related
Yes.
in that particular situation.
Yes. Yeah, I have a talk that I give. It's not a part of the series that I do when I do a weekend series that has 5 talks in them. It's its own separate message sermon. It's called Back to the Future. And the argument is that if you look at how Paul describes the pagan society that he's interacting with in Romans 1, that's pretty direct. That's pretty strong. But if you look at how he talks to those people when he has a chance to address them in Acts 17,
Right.
that's not how he approaches them.
Yeah.
He starts off by saying, I see that you're very religious in every way. And I'm a child of the 60s. So when I read that verse, my initial reaction, given what I read in Romans 1, is, Paul, what have you been smoking? You know, something's happened to you from the time you wrote this to Christians in an insider way about what's going on in society and how fallen the world is on the one hand, and how you actually address someone with hope on the other. And he doesn't back off in Acts 17. He talks about the limitations of the idols that people are connected to. But what he's saying is, I see you're spiritual and interested in spiritual things. So let's talk spiritual things and let's have an honest conversation about them. That's what he's doing. So in the midst of that speech, he challenges them, but on the other hand, he's offering them hope. You know, he says, you know, people grow up for God. They are children of God. They seek spiritual things, etc. And then of course his ultimate answer is, and Jesus is the answer to that spiritual quest. but he does so with a combination of probing that pushes on the one hand and respect on the other that says, let's talk about this in terms of, and I want to start with where you're coming from.
Mhm. Well, I have no other chat questions,
Okay,
so I believe we can wrap up and thank you very much for,
well, you're very, very welcome, and let me thank the audience for their patience and, you know, letting me wade through these texts, and I trust and hope that this has been a beneficial exercise.
yeah, thank you very much.
You're very welcome.
Appreciate it. And for making the trip here too.
Yeah, glad to do it.
Yeah, good.